When Sarah Mitchell discovered her beloved lake cabin was listed for sale without her permission, she thought it was a simple mistake. But what she uncovered next would expose a web of corruption so deep. It would bring down an entire homeowners association and leave one woman facing federal charges. This is the true story of how one illegal real estate listing sparked the most explosive HOA scandal in Virginia history. The morning sun cast long shadows across Lake Anna as Sarah Mitchell pulled into the gravel driveway of her family's cabin for what should have been a peaceful weekend retreat. The 68-year-old retired teacher had inherited the rustic two-bedroom property from her parents 5 years earlier, and it had become her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the chaos of suburban life and reconnect with memories of childhood. Summers spent fishing with her father. But as Sarah approached the front porch, something felt wrong. A bright red for sale sign stood prominently in her front yard, complete with a lockbox dangling from the door handle. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone, dialing the number on the sign with growing panic. Prestige Realty. This is Jennifer speaking. There's been a terrible mistake, Sarah said, her voice shaking. My cabin at 1247 Lakeshore Drive is listed for sale. But I never authorized this. I'm the owner, and I'm standing here right now looking at your sign. The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Jennifer cleared her throat. Ma'am, according to our records, this property was listed by the Lakeshore Estates Homeowners Association. They provided all the necessary documentation showing they have legal authority to sell the property. Why do two, let me see here, significant violations and unpaid fines totaling $47,000? Sarah's knees nearly buckled. What violations? What fines? I've never received any notices about violations. And I certainly don't owe $47,000 to anyone. I'm sorry, Mom, but you'll need to take this up with the HOA. The property is scheduled to be shown this afternoon, and we already have 3 interested buyers. Sarah ended the call and immediately tried her key in the front door. It didn't work. The locks had been changed. Her family photos, her father's fishing equipment, her grandmother's quilt, everything was trapped inside what was now, apparently, someone else's property. With trembling fingers, she called Margaret Hartwell, the HOA president she'd met only once during a brief neighborhood meeting 2 years earlier. Margaret's voice was crisp and cold when she answered. Sarah, I've been expecting your call. Surely you received our numerous violation notices regarding your property's non-compliance with community standards. I never received any notices. Margaret, not one. That's unfortunate. But ignorance of the rules doesn't exempt you from following them. Your cabin violates at least 15 different covenants: the peeling paint, the overgrown vegetation, the non-regulation shutters, the unauthorized fire pit. The list goes on. Plus, you're 3 years behind on your annual assessments. Sarah's mind raced. The cabin was rustic by design, exactly as her parents had built it in 1978. The HOA had been established only 5 years ago, long after the cabin existed. Margaret, the Lakeshore Estates HOA doesn't even have jurisdiction over my property. My cabin was built decades before your development, and I never signed any covenant agreements. Margaret's laugh was sharp and mirthless. I'm afraid you're mistaken, dear. When the county updated the property boundaries in 2019, your little cabin fell within our community limits. You should have received the incorporation paperwork. But since you clearly haven't been maintaining your address with the Postal Service, that explains the communication breakdown. That's impossible. I've lived at the same address for 30 years, and I get mail there every day. Well, regardless, The matter is out of my hands now. The property has been properly condemned and will be sold to recover the outstanding fines. You have 48 hours to remove any personal belongings, supervised by HOA Security. Of course, Sarah felt the world spinning round her. Margaret, you can't just steal someone's property. This is illegal. I'm calling my lawyer. You do that, sweetheart. But I should warn you, we've been very thorough in our documentation. Every violation is photographed and dated. Every fine is properly calculated according to our bylaws, and every legal procedure has been followed to the letter. Your little lawyer will find everything in perfect order. The line went dead. Sarah stood in her driveway, staring at the cabin that had been in her family for decades, now bearing a stranger's for sale sign. She noticed for the first time that several neighbors had gathered across the street, watching her with expressions that ranged from sympathy to curiosity. An older man named Robert approached cautiously. Sarah, I'm so sorry about this. Margaret's been targeting properties all over the neighborhood. The Johnsons lost their house last month over a $200 fine that somehow became $15,000 in penalties. The Chens are fighting a $30,000 assessment for having the wrong color mailbox. How is this possible? Robert glanced around nervously. She's got the whole board in her pocket. Her husband's a real estate developer, and they've been systematically forcing out longtime residents to make way for luxury developments. But Sarah, there's something else you should know. I used to work for the county planning department before I retired. That boundary change Margaret mentioned, it never happened. I checked the records myself. Sarah's shock began transforming into something else, or cold, determined anger. Robert, I need you to tell me everything you know. Because if Margaret Hartwell thinks she can steal my family's property with fake paperwork and intimidation tactics, she's about to learn that she picked the wrong retired teacher to mess with. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in her car outside the offices of Patterson and Associates, clutching a folder full of documents. She had called every contact she could think of, and the picture that emerged was even more disturbing than she had imagined. Margaret Hartwell hadn't just targeted her cabin, she had orchestrated a systematic campaign to seize valuable lakefront properties throughout the community. As Sarah walked toward the law office, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Drop the legal action, or you regret it. This is your only warning. The war for Lakeshore Estates was about to begin. Attorney Michael Patterson leaned back in his leather chair, studying the documents Sarah had spread across his mahogany desk. His 25 years of real estate law had prepared him for many things, but the scope of what Sarah was describing left him genuinely stunned. Double quotes, Mrs. Mitchell. What you're alleging here isn't just property theft, it's organized fraud on a massive scale. If even half of this is true, we're looking at federal crimes. Sarah's hands were steady now, her initial shock replaced by steely determination. Michael, I've spent the last 3 days investigating Margaret Hartwell and her HOA board. What I found is going to shock you. She pulled out a manila folder thick with printouts. First, the boundary change that supposedly brought my cabin under HOA jurisdiction. It never happened. I have written confirmation from the county planning office. Second, Margaret's husband, David Hartwell, owns Prestige Development Group. In the last 2 years, they've purchased 11 properties in our area, all of them sold by the HOA to recover alleged fines. Patterson's eyebrows rose. That's a clear conflict of interest. But there's more. I contacted every family who lost their property. The Johnsons. Their $200 fine for an unauthorized garden gnome somehow accumulated $15,000 in daily penalties. Over 6 months, The Chens, they were fined $30,000 because their mailbox was supposedly the wrong shade of black, a color that was never specified in any covenant. Sarah opened her laptop and turned it toward Patterson. But here's where it gets really interesting. I discovered that Margaret has been intercepting mail. The postal worker, our route, Jenna Mills, has been working our neighborhood for 15 years. When I asked her about all these undelivered violation notices, she said something strange. Margaret Hartwell had submitted a mail forwarding request for multiple addresses in the neighborhood, claiming she was collecting mail for properties in foreclosure. Patterson leaned forward. That's mail fraud, a federal offense. It gets worse. I drove to the county courthouse and pulled the records on every property Margaret's HOA has seized. In each case, the violation notices were allegedly sent to correct addresses. But the certified mail receipts show they were all delivered to the same P.O. Box 1 registered to Margaret Hartwell persona. Lee, not the HOA. Sarah's voice grew stronger. As she continued, I also found something else. David Hartwell's development company has already submitted preliminary plans to the county for a luxury resort development on the exact properties his WA Phase HOA has been seizing. They're calling it Lake Anna Grande Resort and Marina. Patterson was taking notes furiously. This is conspiracy to commit fraud, mail fraud, possibly racketeering under RICO statutes. But Sarah, proving all this in court will require more than circumstantial evidence. We need documentation, witnesses willing to testify, maybe even recorded conversations. That's why I came to you. I need legal advice on how to gather evidence without breaking any laws myself. Patterson thought for a moment. Virginia is a one-party consent state for recording conversations. If you're involved in the conversation, you can legally record it. But more importantly, we need to file an emergency injunction to stop the sale of your property while we investigate. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah became an amateur investigator. She attended every HOA meeting, carefully recording conversations on her phone. She reached out to displaced families, many of whom had been too intimidated or financially drained to fight back. Most importantly, she began building relationships with neighbors who were afraid they might be next. The breakthrough came when Robert, her neighbor who had worked for the county, introduced her to Helen Vasquez, a former HOA board member who had resigned in protest 6 months earlier. Sarah, I've been waiting for someone like you to come along, Helen said as they sat in Sarah's car outside a coffee shop, well away from the neighborhood. I have recordings of Margaret discussing the whole scheme. I started recording board meetings after I realized what was happening, but I was too scared to come forward alone. Helen pulled out her phone and played a chilling recording from a closed board session. Margaret's voice was clear and unmistakable. The Mitchell property is perfect for our next phase. The cabin is isolated, she's elderly and alone, and that lakefront footage is exactly what David needs for the marina access. I've already had the locks changed and the listing prepared. By the time she figures out what's happening, the property will be sold to David's shell company. Another voice, which Helen identified as board treasurer James Walsh, responded, "What about the legal issues? She's going to fight this." Margaret's laugh was cold. With what money? By the time she hires a lawyer and fights through the appeals process, we'll have clear title and construction will already be underway. These old-timers never have the resources for a prolonged legal battle. Sarah felt her blood pressure rising as the recording continued. Margaret's voice came through again. The beauty of the system is that it's all perfectly legal on paper. The violations are real according to our bylaws. The fines are calculated correctly. And the sale procedures follow state law. The only thing these people can't prove is that they never received the notices, and good luck proving a negative. Sarah looked at Helen with new respect. How many more recordings do you have? Months worth. Margaret got careless because she never suspected anyone on the board would turn against her. I documented everything: the mail forwarding scheme, the inflated fines, the coordination with David's development company, even discussions about bribing a county inspector. That evening, Sarah called Patterson with the news. Michael, we've got them. But I want to do more than just save my cabin. I want to make sure they can never do this to anyone else. Patterson's voice was grim. Sarah, what you're describing could bring down the entire operation, but you need to be prepared when we file these charges. Margaret and her associates are going to fight back hard. They have a lot of money and a lot to lose. Let them come, Sarah replied, staring out at the lake where her father had taught her to fish all those years ago. They made one critical mistake when they targeted my family's cabin. They assumed I was just another elderly victim who would quietly disappear. They have no idea who they're dealing with. The next morning, Sarah woke to find her car windows smashed and a note on her windshield. Last warning, walk away. Now or face the consequences. Instead of intimidating her, the vandalism only strengthened her resolve. Margaret Hartwell was about to discover that some fights are worth everything. The Spotsylvania County Courthouse was packed on the morning of October 15th as Sarah Mitchell's case against the Lakeshore Estates HOA was called to order. Judge Elizabeth Warren, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years on the bench, surveyed the crowded courtroom with interest. Word of the case had spread throughout the legal community, and several attorneys had come to observe what promised to be an extraordinary hearing. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table with Michael Patterson, surrounded by boxes of evidence they had meticulously gathered over the past 2 months. Across the aisle, Margaret Hartwell was flanked by 3 expensive lawyers from Richmond's most prestigious firm, their tailored suits and confident demeanor projecting an air of invincibility. Patterson rose for his opening statement, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. Your Honor, what we will prove today is not simply a property dispute, but a carefully orchestrated criminal conspiracy designed to defraud homeowners of their most valuable assets through systematic mail fraud, document forgery, and abuse of legal process. Margaret's lead attorney, Thomas Blackwood, a silver-haired man with a reputation for winning impossible cases, responded with smooth confidence. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a disgruntled property owner who failed to maintain her obligations to the community and now seeks to avoid the consequences through baseless accusations and conspiracy theories. The first witness Patterson called was Jonna Mills, the postal worker. Her testimony was devastating. I've been delivering mail to Lakeshore Estates for 15 years, Jonna said, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. In March of this year, Mrs. Hartwell submitted forwarding orders for over 20 addresses in the neighborhood. When I questioned it, she said she was helping neighbors who were having financial difficulties. But the forwarding address was always the same P.O. box registered to her personally. Blackwood's cross-examination was aggressive. Ms. Mills, isn't it true that mail forwarding is a common service requested by property managers and HOA officials? Yes, but typically with proper documentation from the property owners. Mrs. Hartwell never provided that documentation, and when I asked for it, she became very hostile and threatened to report me to my supervisor. Patterson's next witness was Helen Vasquez, the former HOA board member. As Helen took the stand, Margaret visibly stiffened in her chair. Mrs. Vasquez, why did you begin recording HOA board meetings? Helen's voice was firm. I started to suspect that Mrs. Hartwell was manipulating the violation and fine process. Properties were being targeted based on their value and location rather than actual covenant violations. Patterson played the first recording. Margaret's voice filling the courtroom as she discussed targeting Sarah's cabin for the marina. Access. Murmurs rippled through the gallery as the conspiracy was laid bare in Margaret's own words. But Helen's most damaging testimony was yet to come. Mrs. Vasquez. Did you witness any other illegal activities by the defendant? Yes. In July, I watched Mrs. Hartwell use official HOA letterhead to create backdated violation notices. She had a template on her computer with blank dates and property addresses. She would fill them in after the fact to make it appear that proper notice had been given. Blackwood's objection was swift. Hearsay, Your Honor. The witness cannot testify to the contents of documents she merely observed. Sustained, Judge Warren ruled. But the damage was done. The jury had heard the allegation. Patterson then played his trump card. Your Honor, I'd like to call David Hartwell to the stand. The courtroom erupted in whispers. David Hartwell, Margaret's husband, and the developer who had been purchasing the seized properties, had not been listed as a witness. His attorneys immediately objected. Your Honor, Mr. Hartwell is not a party to this action and has not been properly subpoenaed. Judge Warren looked to Patterson. Counselor, explain yourself. Your Honor, Mr. Hartwell was served with a subpoena this morning. We have evidence of his direct involvement in the conspiracy. David Hartwell took the stand reluctantly, his usual confidence replaced by obvious anxiety. Patterson wasted no time. Mr. Hartwell, isn't it true that your development company has purchased 11 properties from the lakeshore estates in the past 2 years? Yes, but those were legitimate business transactions at significantly below market value. The properties required extensive renovation. Patterson pulled out a document. This is your preliminary development plan filed with the county, dated 6 months before your wife's HOA began targeting lakefront properties. Isn't it true that you identified specific properties for acquisition before any violations were allegedly discovered? David's attorney stood. Objection, Your Honor. This line of questioning assumes facts not in evidence. I'll allow it, Judge, Warren said, leaning forward with interest. David shifted uncomfortably. Development planning requires long-term property analysis. It's standard business practice. Mr. Hartwell, did you ever discuss with your wife which properties should be targeted for HOA violations? No, absolutely not. Patterson smiled and nodded to his assistant, who began setting up an audio player. Your Honor, I'd like to play a recording from an HOA board meeting held on August 15th. The courtroom fell silent as Margaret's voice filled the room. David said the waterfront access is crucial for Phase 2. We need the Mitchell property and the 3 lots north of it. I don't care what violations we have to find or create. David's face went pale. Margaret shot him a look of pure fury from across the courtroom. But Patterson wasn't finished. Mr. Hartwell, have you ever discussed creating false violations with your wife? I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The courtroom exploded. Judge Warren's gavel rang out repeatedly as she called for order. Blackwood was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, we request an immediate recess to consult with our clients. Denied. Mr. Patterson, do you have additional evidence? Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to present county records showing that the boundary changes allegedly bringing these properties under HOA jurisdiction never occurred. Postal Service records documenting the fraudulent mail forwarding, and financial records showing payments from Mr. Hartwell's development company to his wife's personal account. As Patterson laid out document after document, the web of corruption became undeniable. Margaret Hartwell's confident facade crumbled as the evidence mounted against her. But the biggest shock was yet to come. Judge Warren called for a brief recess, and as the courtroom began to empty, Margaret turned to her husband with venom in her voice. "You idiot. You were supposed to destroy those development plans." What Margaret didn't know was that Sarah had been recording every word. Judge Warren returned to the bench with an expression that could have frozen Lake Anna itself. The courtroom fell silent as she shuffled through the mountain of evidence that had been presented over grueling days of testimony. "In my 30 years on this bench," Judge Warren began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "I have rarely encountered such a systematic and callous abuse of legal process. The evidence presented in this case reveals not just individual criminal acts, but a conspiracy that strikes at the very foundation of property rights and community trust." Sarah felt her heart pounding as the judge continued. Margaret Hartwell sat motionless at the defense table, her expensive lawyers looking like they wanted to disappear into the floor. "The court finds that the defendant, Margaret Hartwell, acting in her capacity as HOA president, did knowingly and willfully engage in mail fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy to commit theft by deception. The so-called violations cited against Mrs. Mitchell's property were fabricated. The fines were calculated through fraudulent means, and the sale of the property was conducted without legal authority." Judge Warren's voice grew stronger. "Furthermore, the evidence clearly demonstrates that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of criminal behavior designed to systematically defraud homeowners of their property rights for personal gain." Sarah squeezed Patterson's hand as the judge delivered the verdict she had fought so hard to achieve. "The court hereby orders the immediate return of all seized properties to their rightful owners, declares all HOA fines and assessments void and unenforceable, and awards Mrs. Mitchell compensatory damages in the amount of $500,000 for emotional distress, legal fees, and punitive damages." The courtroom erupted in applause from the dozen families who had been victimized by Margaret's scheme. But Judge Warren wasn't finished. "Additionally, this court is referring all evidence of criminal activity to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for prosecution under federal mail fraud and racketeering statutes. Mrs. Hartwell, you are hereby remanded into custody pending federal charges." As the bailiff approached Margaret with handcuffs, she finally spoke, her voice shrill with desperation. "This is ridiculous. I was protecting property values. These people were destroying our community." But it was David Hartwell's reaction that stunned everyone in the courtroom. Instead of supporting his wife, he stood up and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, I have information that might be relevant to the federal investigation." Margaret's face went white. "David, what are you doing?" Patterson and Sarah exchanged glances. This wasn't part of any plan they had discussed. Judge Warren raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Hartwell, you are not compelled to speak without counsel present. I understand, Your Honor. But I want to cooperate fully. My wife, she's not the mastermind. Here, there's someone else involved. Someone who's been orchestrating this entire operation." The courtroom fell dead silent. Margaret's attorneys were frantically whispering to each other. Clearly caught off guard by this development, David continued, his voice growing steadier. 6 months ago, my wife was approached by someone who claimed to represent a consortium of investors interested in developing lakefront properties around Virginia. They provided her with a detailed playbook for using HOA violations to acquire properties below market value. They even provided the legal documents and templates she used. Patterson was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, This is highly irregular. If Mr. Hartwell has evidence of additional criminal activity, it should be presented through proper channels. But David wasn't finished. The person who contacted my wife was Catherine Morrison, a former county official who was forced to resign 3 years ago after being caught taking bribes from developers. She's been running this same scheme in at least 4 other counties across Virginia. Margaret finally found her voice, and it was filled with rage. David, you coward. You were in on this from the beginning. You're the one who identified the properties. You're the one who... Enough. Judge Warren's gavel cracked like thunder. Mrs. Hartwell, you have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise it. But the biggest shock was yet to come. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, and when she looked at it, her face went pale. She quickly showed it to Patterson, who immediately stood. Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption, but I've just received information that Catherine Morrison was arrested this morning by the FBI at her home in Richmond. Apparently, she's been running identical HOA fraud schemes in 7 counties. Not 4. The total amount of property theft is estimated at over $50 million. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Judge Warren banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. As the noise died down, Sarah realized something that made her smile for the first time in months. Margaret Hartwell, the woman who had tried to steal her family's cabin, was not just facing jail time, she was facing federal charges as part of the largest property fraud ring in Virginia history. But the real twist was yet to be revealed as the deputies led Margaret away in handcuffs. Sarah's phone rang. It was Robert, her neighbor who had first warned her about Margaret's tactics. Sarah, you need to turn on the news right now. Sarah opened her news app and gasped. The headline read, FBI raids reveal massive horror fraud ring. Dozens of officials arrested in 7-state operation. Catherine Morrison, it turned out, had been running horror fraud schemes across multiple states, training local officials like Margaret to systematically steal properties using fake violations and mail FR. Odd, the FBI had been investigating her for 2 years, and Sarah's case had provided the final piece of evidence they needed to bring down the entire operation. 3 months later, Sarah stood on the deck of her restored lake cabin, watching the sunrise paint the water gold. The cabin was exactly as her parents had built it, complete with the non-regulation shutters and the unauthorized fire pit where she and her father had roasted marshmallows decades ago. Margaret Hartwell had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. David Hartwell had received 5 years for his cooperation. Catherine Morrison was facing life in prison under federal racketeering charges. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the class action lawsuit Sarah had helped organize. The victims of the HOA fraud ring had collectively been awarded over $200 million in damages, money that would be paid from the seized assets of the criminal organization. As Sarah sipped her morning coffee, she reflected on the lesson that had emerged from her ordeal. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't money, or connections, or political influence. Sometimes it's just one person who refuses to be bullied, who has the courage to stand up and fight back. Her phone buzzed with a message from Patterson. Sarah, I hope you're enjoying your morning. I wanted you to know that 3 more states have contacted us about similar HOA fraud cases. Would you be interested in helping other victims fight back? Sarah smiled and typed her response. When do we start? The sun climbed higher over Lake Anna, casting its light on a community that had learned the hard way that justice sometimes comes slowly, but it comes, and sometimes the person who looks like the easiest target turns out to be the most dangerous opponent of all. Call to action. If you or someone you know has been victimized by HOA fraud or abuse, don't stay silent, document everything, seek legal counsel, and remember you have more power than you think. One person really can make a difference. And sometimes the fight for justice starts with refusing to back down when you know you're right.